That's possible. He's just returned from a border dispute on Ansonian.
And here's the story behind that line. Let's dive in. So today we're reviewing Star Wars The Approaching Storm, and it was written by Alan Dean Foster. It takes place 22 years BBY. There was a rule that I made for myself when I was reading these books, and that was that if they had stories that took place in the same year, I would read the canon stories first and then the legend stories. Well, the last book that we reviewed was Brotherhood, which also took place in 22 BBY. However, that book and the events of episode 2 and the events of this book all take place in the same year, according to Star Wars chronology. That was kind of a mistake on my part. I'm going to try to do better and recognize that in the future when I'm reading these books and make sure I'm reading them in the actual chronological order that I want to, because my OCD just can't stand it if I don't. But it's okay this time. We'll move forward and we'll check out this story and the other stories that come later. But before we move forward, I just want to remind everybody that if you would like to purchase this book, there will be a link in the description for this book and the next 3 books that I'll be reading on this channel. But just keep in mind that I am an Amazon affiliate, so if you use these links to purchase the books, then it will benefit me or the channel in some way. But don't do it to benefit me, please. I appreciate it if you do, but do it so that way we can continue this conversation, get it in front of more eyes and ears, and just spark up some debates about Star Wars as a whole. And if you liked the content that you saw today, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can talk more in the future. A really popular thing for authors to do, especially when the prequels came out and shortly after, was to investigate the times between episode 1 and 3 when the Separatists and the Republic were vying for people's support to increase their numbers and move forward with the galaxy the way that they want to see it. The Republic wants to continue to exist and improve. The Separatists just don't think that they're capable of doing that. They think that the Republic is just on a bad path and they want to move forward with a better way of living. Well, we all know that that's just manipulation by Chancellor Palpatine or Darth Sidious. That's what everybody believes is on their plate at the moment. So we're going to go with that. This is no different of a story. It takes place on a planet called Ansonian. There is a border dispute going on in Ansonian. Remember that line that I just played for you in the intro?
That's possible. He's just returned from a border dispute on Ansonian.
It's between the city folk of Ansonian, which is known as the Unity of Community. I didn't know it rhymed until I just said it. And the Alwari, which the Alwari are a nomadic people that live in more of the rural regions of Ansonian. The Unity of Community have denounced the Alwari. They don't want them a part of their way of life. Well, Ansonian is undergoing a vote of whether to stay with the Republic or go with the Separatists. The Jedi and the Republic obviously don't want to see that happen. They don't want to see them leave the Republic. However, on its face, Ansonian does not look like a very significant planet. The population isn't super significant. There's not a lot of production from the planet. However, the planet has a lot of ties with strong organizations outside of their atmosphere, which I did not commit them to memory, but that's the premise of the book, is that Ansonian is connected to a lot of different important factions, and if they decide to join the Separatists, that could start a chain of events which would make other people also leave the Republic and join the Separatists. So obviously the Jedi and the Republic have a strong interest in keeping Ansonian in the Republic. There's a mission that goes on at the beginning of the book with Luminara Unduli and Barriss Offee, her Padawan at the time. Obi-Wan and Anakin just happen to show up and get them out of a tight spot right away. But then they're all sent, or at least Luminara Unduli and Obi-Wan Kenobi are sent to Ansonian to resolve this border dispute and see if also they can convince them to vote in favor of staying with the Republic. Those 2 are sent, so obviously they're going to bring their Padawans with them, so all 4 of them are going. They go through a series of trials. They almost get killed by one of the Alwari clans, that's Merchant Clan. When they get there, the Unity of Community says that they're willing to stay with the Republic. The Alwari apparently are hostile towards the city folk of Ansonian, and they want the Jedi to talk to the Alwari and make sure that they can live in peace. Even though it kind of starts out where the city folk denounce the Alwari, that might be because the Alwari are hostile to them. I can't remember exactly, but one of their stipulations is that talk to the Alwari, make sure that we can come to an agreement to live in peace, and then we'll stay with the Republic. So they go through several trials. They meet different clans of the Alwari, and eventually they're led to the High Clan, which is the Borokai. The Borokai give them an audience, but only after they complete this crazy task of shaving some fur off of a white, I think it's a white Lurqual. It might be a different animal. The Lurqual were like these really large beasts in the book that were dangerous to be around because they traveled in herds. Because of their size, you did not want to be around them. So anyway, Master Unduli takes on the task and is able to do it. They convince the High Clan to talk to the other clans and keep peace between the Alwari and the city folk of Ansonian. And they make it back to the Unity of Community just in time to explain to them their progress and convince them to stay with the Republic. So all good, happy ending. I'm glad I was able to stay a little bit more concise this time. That feels a lot better. So like I said at the start, during this time, 2002, 2004, it seemed to be a popular thing to talk about the different stories in between episode 1 and 3 of different worlds that were on the balance of whether they were going to stay with the Republic or join the Separatists. But my litmus test for whether the story becomes more engaging or less engaging is, does it actually connect directly with anything mentioned in the major episodes of Star Wars? And at first I didn't think it did, because I had never heard of Ansonian or the underlying stories that go with it. But there was one throwaway line in episode 2, which that's probably the episode I saw the least of in terms of how many times I've seen it. I've seen episode 30,000 times because I love that movie. And episode 1 I've seen more than episode 2, I'm sure. But it was the throwaway line was the clip that I played for you earlier. Obi-Wan had just returned from a border dispute on Ansonian. And I didn't realize that was there, but that definitely made the story more engaging. And it also brought a lot of depth to episode 2, and also just the stories, all of the stories involving what they were required to do during the Clone Wars to try to get people on their side. So since it does expand on that point, it made the story better for me. And it's an easy line to forget because it's not really a major point in the movie, and it's nothing major happens before or after it. I think that was one of the least liked movies of the prequels. It's a toss-up between episode 1 and 2, to be honest with you. Episode 3, a lot of people agree, one of the best. I think it's easily the best movie. So with this rebrand comes another new segment I wanted to try to get into, which was things that are mentioned in the book, that different characters or places that I wanted to see if they were exclusive to this book or if they were mentioned in other stories. I collected about 8 different things that stood out to me that I wanted to see if they were involved in other stories or if they just stayed in this story. A couple of things right away. The Alwari, which are the nomadic people of Ansonian, they are actually mentioned in 3 other books, likely because they've been given some significance since they are one of the 2 parties involved in a border dispute, which was explicitly mentioned in episode 2. So the 3 stories they're mentioned in are MedStar 2 Jedi Healer, Star Wars Revenge of the Sith novelization, and Coruscant Nights 2 Street of Shadows. I have not read any of these books, so I don't know where they're mentioned in those books, but it does allow for this faction of people to creep into the canon storyline at some point in the future, which I think, given the way they're described and talked about, it could be a really interesting group of people to bring into canon because they operate very primitively compared to other people in the galaxy. They still use some good technology, but they do a lot of things in a primitive fashion out of tradition and the way that they've lived for as long as they have. So it's an interesting group of people to go further into if they're going to bring it to live action or an animated series or something like that. So far, I don't believe it's been mentioned in any other movie or TV show, just in those 3 books that I mentioned, plus The Approaching Storm. The other thing that was not exclusive to this book were Subitars, which were large beasts. They were 6-legged, and they were seen as a high-class choice of ride for the Alwari. If you owned one and you rode one, you were of some importance and significance, and it was seen as a very classy pick for someone to ride through the rural regions of Ansonian with. So they're mentioned in this book, and they're also mentioned in the episode 3 novelization. Again, I haven't read that book. I don't know where it's mentioned in the book. Also an interesting character that'd be cool to see how the appearance of that would be interpreted in an animated or a live action format. The other things I'm going to mention are exclusive to this book. They haven't been mentioned in any other book. One would be Sorg the Hutt. He is a boss band that's stationed on Ansonian, and much like the other Hutts, he rules the underworld crime on that planet. He is only mentioned in this book. There's a couple of deities that are mentioned that one of the characters, Kayakta, believes in. One of them was War, W-H-A-R-H. There's a statement in the story where she says the winds of war, which I believe has to do with how this deity would influence the moment in some way. Only mentioned in this book. Uldas is another one. That's another deity of Ansonian. If Uldas is with you, good fortune is upon you, basically. Only mentioned in this book. Hyrin are these small black flying creatures that have no legs. They fly basically all the time. They can't move out of the way when they fly. They travel in these large herds, and when they do, they go in this one direction. If there's buildings or anything in the way, they will not fly out of the way of that thing. They'll just keep flying forward. It's kind of amazing to me that this creature would be introduced and has not become extinct yet, because how can you have a group of animals that could just fly into things, probably die, and they continue to reproduce? They must reproduce at a really high rate, kind of like insects or something like that. Oh, and you can't eat them because they taste like boiled mud when you try to cook them, and they're full of grease, so that's disgusting. The Chawix, it's a poisonous plant that's native to Ansonian. In some part of the book, this was significant, forget which part, but only mentioned in this book. And the last thing would be the Lorqual, which were these large beasts, so large you don't want to be near them because you'll probably get crushed based on the size. Only mentioned in this book as well. Now that we've covered a lot of different creatures and my opinion of the book, we're going to dive into more of the interesting things that I found in this book. Master Unduli and Barriss Offee are in this mission at the beginning of the book that I mentioned earlier, and they are caught between a bunch of attackers and in a tight spot. This was before Obi-Wan and Anakin showed up, but Luminara Unduli makes a weird statement. There are only two ways for non-Jedi to defeat Jedi in battle: lull them into a false sense of security or overwhelm them with sheer force of numbers. It's a weird statement because she's assuming that unless you have a bunch of people attacking one Jedi, or you sneak up on a Jedi, those are the only two ways Jedi can die. They can't die from hand-to-hand combat from one person, and she says non-Jedi, so what, Sith Lords can't defeat Jedi? That's what it insinuates. I don't know if Mr. Foster is making this assumption or if he is trying to convey that this is what Luminara Unduli believes when it comes to the Jedi. We know that a lot of the Jedi had very arrogant feelings about what their capabilities were, but this is just one of those arrogant feelings. So this book was written very shortly after Star Wars Attack of the Clones was released, and I came to an opinion early in the book that Anakin was written in a very good mix between how episode 2 and 3 Anakin are and how Clone Wars Anakin is, which, you know, episode 2 Anakin can't really relate to any other version of Anakin because that's the teenage whiny kid that you don't really see in the Clone Wars, and you definitely don't see it in episode 3. It's probably closer to the episode 3 Anakin than the Clone Wars Anakin. Anyway, even though the Clone Wars TV series hadn't been released in some time, Anakin was showing a very sarcastic, witty attitude in this book, and that's very much like Clone Wars Anakin, not much at all like episode 3 Anakin. It was interesting how Alan Dean Foster captured that good mix of Anakin in this book, and I found it really engaging. Sorg the Hutt was the boss band that is stationed on Ansion in this book, and he has a very large interest in Ansion joining the Separatists. Because the Jedi are involving themselves, Sorg the Hutt wants to kidnap the Jedi and try to force the Jedi in Coruscant to, I guess, to save Obi-Wan and Luminara and basically withdraw their involvement in the Ansion dispute. And to do this, he sends two people that seem to be mentally handicapped. And the reason behind it was that Jedi are very good at sensing people's intentions. And if you send two people that are mentally handicapped, they think all sorts of weird things. The Jedi would not be able to sense their intentions because of them being handicapped, I guess. And it was just a weird thing for him to assume, and also a weird action to take. But anyway, he sends them, and they get to Barriss Offee in a little shop and kidnap her. So that part of it worked. However, in the same moment, Barriss Offee used the Force to cure them of their mentally handicappedness, which was very interesting in itself. I mentioned before that Barriss Offee actually healed her two attackers that seemed to be mentally of their handicap, and she was talking to them, and they were weary of what that the Jedi might try to trick them. She wanted to convince them that she was willing to help them and also still let them go through with what they needed to do. I guess she wasn't really worried. Didn't seem like they would be violent in any way towards her. She promises them that she can clear their head up and cure them of the pain in their heads, she says. And then all of a sudden they're just talking very normally. Their vocabulary is greatly increased, and they're just all of a sudden insightful people. It is kind of a weird foreshadowing because you have to admit it's kind of an unnatural thing to do with the Force. And as we know, the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities that people would consider unnatural. And it's interesting that Barriss Offee eventually turns to the dark side anyways. That came to mind when I was reading this part. Anakin and Obi-Wan are being forced into riding the Subatar beasts to go talk to the Alwari, and two people that Barriss Offee cured of their mentally handicapped are the ones that told them that this was a good idea to ride these beasts. And Anakin says that he felt more comfortable with machines, not with animals, and which makes sense because he likes to tinker and build things, and that particular comment didn't seem out of place. However, we do know that in episode 2 he pretty easily subdues an animal right before the Battle of Geonosis when they are in that little gladiator scene, and he does it pretty well. I think that's an ability that he's actually known for in canon references. It was just weird for him to say that he was uncomfortable being with beasts. I thought that he would probably be more comfortable than that, but maybe the author was just trying to differentiate his love of tinkering with machines from what they were being forced to do to resolve this dispute. Anakin, Obi-Wan, Master Unduli, and Barriss Offee are all forced to undergo a bunch of trials with different clans of the Alwari. One of the clans that they meet up with is the Yiwa clan. The Yiwa were going to lead them in the direction of the Borokai, which was a high clan that they needed to convince to talk to the other clans and resolve their dispute with the city folk. The trial that they were tasked with doing was they had to impress the Yiwa elders, basically, with some kind of a performance, whether it be like a physical lightsaber performance to fascinate them or storytelling or whatever. They just needed to find a way to entertain the Yiwa crowd that was before them and the elders. Master Unduli had a really interesting one. Barriss Offee had probably the most conventional one, where she did dance with the lightsaber and a lot of basically like karate presentation. If I was finding a relative way to describe it, obviously they don't know that they do karate, but it was a lightsaber presentation basically. Anakin chose a very interesting thing to do, and he sang a song that his mother sang to him when he was young, or at least that's what he said in the book. Apparently his singing was so amazing that it impressed the Yiwa elders and the Yiwa clan. It's not canon, but apparently it's referenced that Anakin is a good singer, and who knew? There's cave-dwelling species of Ansion that is still the same as the species that live in the city and with the Elwari, but they're smaller and they look a little different than the rest of the species, but they're still Ansonian. And one of the people they run into with this species, his name is Toki. He was kind of like an annoying character where he said, I'm the biggest and the strongest and the smartest of my people. He's always bragging about how big and smart he was with his people. It was very reminiscent of Jar Jar, how annoying he was, and the other characters in the book felt that he was annoying also. The story has its own Jar Jar, and I was not overly excited to read that. The four Jedi run into a merchant clan, the Kulon, or Kulun, I think that's what they were called, and were drugged when they met with this clan. I think they were sent by Sorg the Hutt to capture him since those two attackers before couldn't do it or abandoned their mission to do it. They were drugged with this like gas that was in the air, and they were supposed to smell it because they were trying to sell it to him as if it was this like, I don't know, scent to have about to make you feel better, but it ended up just knocking them out instead. So the thing is, it was kind of a slow descent into an unconscious state for the Jedi. It allowed for them to take some action until they were fully knocked out, but it just made me think of the Bane series when Bane was explicit about how the Sith could ward off poison using the Force. They used the dark side of the Force to do it, but they had the ability to do it using the Force. And the Jedi do not have that ability. Maybe it's an unnatural thing to do. It definitely makes them seem weaker that they can't ward off any toxicity in their body or poison or what have you, like the Sith can. Another thing that I was triggered to remember in this book was that among the Elwari clan, basically all of the clans of the Elwari used some form of primitive tradition, whether it be how they travel, how they eat, how they entertain themselves, whatever. They all possess technology, but for the most part, they didn't use it in the fullest of their potential because they wanted to stick to things that they used centuries ago. In fact, one of the lights that I think it was the Yiwa clan, one of the lights that they used purposefully flickered so that it would mimic like the flickering of a flame on a torch. So it was interesting the way that they choose to live. But it also reminded me that almost all the species that we're introduced to in the animated series and the movies, they all have an advanced civilization. They all use technology supposedly to their fullest extent, fullest potential. And you don't really see very many primitive people. However, I shouldn't say that. The Ewoks were one of them, but there's not very many. And it's easy to forget that could be a lot of them that exist in the galaxy. And I think it would be interesting to encounter more of them along the way. And the last thing that I found interesting in this book, and just a thought that I had while reading, and that's what all of these are. They're just thoughts that come up while I'm reading, that whether they have to do with the book or just have to do with the way the characters are being portrayed. But the Jedi are not allowed to take on political positions because of the fact that it's a position of power, and that could easily corrupt the Jedi into going to the dark side. Well, even though they're not allowed positions of power in the political spectrum, Obi-Wan seems like he would be a very, very good politician. And I say that because his biggest strength, especially when reading books, I don't necessarily know that it's highlighted as much in the movies or in the animated series, but is that he's a very, very good negotiator. He is very patient when it comes to, he doesn't really give up on diplomacy. Anakin would go for aggressive negotiations immediately most of the time, but Obi-Wan just always stuck to negotiating, and he always was able to say the right things to get people to compromise with him and to agree with him. I just thought he would make a really good politician if he were allowed to be in a position of power. So we've wrapped up the things that I found interesting. Again, it was an interesting story. One thing that I thought after reading it was this seemed like a very short story that was dragged on in a very long way. And that's really why I was able to describe it so easily at the beginning of this video. Everything seemed like, every scene and every conversation seemed like it was dragged out very, very long. They could have easily told this story in 100 pages. The Jedi go to Ansonian to talk to the city folk. The city folk say that, oh, we need to make peace with the Elwari. They go talk to 5 different clans of the Elwari, and the High Clan agrees after they go through a bunch of trials, and boom, story done. It just felt dragged on to me. And that made the story less engaging. Knowing where the story comes from makes it a little bit better for me, but I'm only going to give this a 7.2. I felt like there could have been more potential for this story to grow into something better than what was told in this book. As you know, any throwaway line can be brought into a very good story. But there wasn't anything spectacular that happened in this book. No spectacular display of power by the Jedi or anybody else, really. It was just a lot of talking, a lot of negotiating, some assignments and trials for the Jedi to fight through, a botched kidnapping attempt. It was just okay. Not great, not bad. So I appreciate everybody that showed up to watch the video today. May the Force be with you, and everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.